So, what is Canada's current legislation with regards to the sex trade?
So first, I think it's a good idea to sort of contextualize the sort of history of prostitution and sex work legislation in Canada, because we have a very old sort of history when it comes to statutes and laws. So we inherited essentially our laws, most of our laws, criminal laws, property laws, from the English system. So this sort of history of controlling and criminalizing sexual behavior, in particular sexual behavior of women, is a very old history. So it's not something that, as most people think, is relatively new in Canada. Our laws in particular date back to the late 1700s. The laws surrounding prostitution remained largely unchanged until the drafting and the enactment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, which is really interesting to think about, that we had those laws that went largely unchallenged for centuries. It really was not until the Supreme Court ruling challenge of 2013 that was the most significant monumental change to prostitution and sex work legislation in Canada. They didn't legalize prostitution because it wasn't necessarily illegal. What they did was they believed that those restrictions to prostitution and those statutes and laws endangered the lives of sex workers themselves primarily. So it really affected and impacted whether or not they could do what they did safely.
Okay, what do you think some of the problems with the current legislation are?
So what happened is that the Supreme Court of Canada, as it always does, gave the then Conservative government 1 year to address the fact that there were now almost no rules or laws related to sex work in Canada. The Conservative government at the time took advantage of this opportunity, and while there were no laws, created very strict and severe laws that criminalized prostitution and made prostitution illegal in Canada through Bill C-36. So the current Liberal government has not addressed Bill C-36, which I think Justin Trudeau, now Prime Minister, will do.
So now if you specifically were the person who had control of the legislation regarding sex work, how would you personally change it? Like, what would you make the laws?
I would completely repeal Bill C-36. I don't think the intention of the law is right. I think it came from the wrong place. The Conservative government had an incredibly right-wing conservative approach to addressing a moral issue, and social and moral regulation are the end goals in this. But I would also consult with sex workers themselves, because those are the ones, if we're considering the goal of decriminalizing prostitution as harm reduction, then those women themselves who are participating in the trade, who are working and doing those things, should have a voice in that legislation. But again, I would stress that recognizing the goals of what we would like to do, is it harm reduction, is it safety, is it the emancipation of women, is it social control? We have to understand those goals in particular and what we're trying to do in this before essentially we can do anything.
What are some of the struggles that specifically women of color face while working in the sex trade? Like, are they more likely to face violence, make less money?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because when we start to combine multiple factors or multiple issues, the situation becomes even more disconcerting or concerning itself. The dozens of women who went missing along a very remote 700-kilometer stretch in northern British Columbia went largely ignored by police, politicians, and policymakers in British Columbia until a young white girl went missing. Again, it's not surprising that it was those women in particular that he selected. And when we consider sex work in light of what happened in Robert Pickton's case, we can, understand why we're calling for significant changes to legislation. They're complicated issues, they're polarizing issues, they're moral issues, they're issues of deviance and normality, social and moral regulation, and Canadians are not always comfortable having those conversations, and looking to the criminal justice system to address those things is not always the right option, especially if we look at how those women and girls were treated by the criminal justice system and Robert Pickton himself. So their issues, sex work and being an Aboriginal woman, are two issues that are sort of inexorably linked, and I think that it's sort of begets a larger conversation about violence against women and about racism and about patriarchy in particular.